So greeting everyone once again and welcome to the 90th session of the online Optom Learning series. Let me introduce to you our speaker for today. So it gives me an immense pleasure to welcome Dr. Shrikant Bharadwaj onto our platform. Dr. Shrikant completed his undergraduate degree in optometry from the prestigious Elite School of Optometry, Chennai, and then went ahead and did his PhD in Vision Science from the University of California, Berkeley School of Optometry, USA. After completing his postdoctoral training in vision science at Indiana University School of Optometry, he then returned to LV Prasad Eye Institute in Hyderabad and as a fellow in 2009. He then went ahead and established the Visual Optics Research Laboratory at LVPEI, with the overall agenda of understanding the optics of the eye, which influences on spatial vision and depth perception being the more focused area. He uses a combination of experimental methods, behavioral and computational techniques to address the research agenda in his research lab. He is also invited editor of the Nature Scientific Reports and Optometry and Vision Science Journal. He has numerous publications in the field of optometry and vision science in peer-reviewed journals, international journals as well. Apart from his research work, which is his main forte and he's famous for, he also serves as the director of the Brian Holden Institute of Optometry and Vision Science School at LVPEI, and also actively involved in teaching at the Bausch & Lomb School of Optometry. So welcome, Dr. Shrikant, for taking up this session onto our platform. And today, sir is going to talk to us about something which is unique when the topic kind of sounds very interesting. You know, it's kind of when distorted optics meets binocular visions, and this is from the lessons we will know from keratoconus perspective. So welcome, Dr. Shrikant, onto our platform. Let me leave the screen time to you now.
Thank you, Fakhruddin. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Fakhruddin, for the kind invitation and also for the very generous introduction. I completely respect that this is Sunday evening and all of you may have other better things to do. So despite that, if I'm seeing 60 odd people attending this session, then Wolves must be doing a fantastic job in terms of inviting good speakers. And that sort of adds some additional pressure on me to keep up to that expectations and deliver something that is relevant to the audience that are currently in the attending this session. So the poll that was run some time ago actually was very good because it gives me a good flavor for who's all attending the session. And sounds like majority of them are students of optometry, one year or the other, either in an undergraduate or in a postgraduate program. I will try and cater to the level of an undergraduate student of optometry. I will have to make certain assumptions in your understanding of the topic if we have to cover this topic, cover the title in any meaningful manner. So if there is questions related to what I am saying, if something is not making sense and stuff, then please do put your questions in the chat box and we can always sit and discuss that towards the end of the session. So the formal title is When Distorted Optics Meets Binocular Vision. This is largely going to be work that is done in the laboratory over the past few years, and I'll try and summarize what we have learned from this disease condition in terms of how does the visual system handle distorted optics that's reaching the brain for processing. So I am a very collaborative animal, and I do have to acknowledge the host of collaborators and students that have truly helped me build the lab and publish all the papers that Fakhruddin was talking about. These are pretty much people from across the globe who have helped me either build systems, increase my understanding of the topics, or meaningfully contributed in one way or the other to the work that we have been doing. Of special relevance for this particular talk are these six individuals whose work that I will primarily be covering. Vinay, who is currently now a PhD student at the Queensland University of Technology in Australia. Bhagya, who is a PhD student with me, presently working towards a PhD at the City University of London. Preeti, a research optometrist aspiring to be a PhD student. Preetam, also a PhD student with City University of London, classmates with Bhagya. And Sangeeta Metlapalli, who is a faculty member at the New England College of Optometry in Boston. And my PhD advisor, Professor Clifton Shaw at Berkeley. He is retired now, and he's taking singing lessons apart from all the vision science that he has been doing through the years. So, all these individuals have been extremely instrumental in the work that I do. So in some ways, I am only their mouthpiece. They are the ones who are been doing all the groundwork in the laboratory. So I do also have to acknowledge the funding that has helped me do all of this. Fight for Sight, all the way from a postdoctoral fellowship several years ago to the Ramalinga Swamy Fellowship that helped me establish the lab, and several extramural grants from the Government of India and the industry that has helped us do what we are currently doing. I do not have any financial disclosures, and most of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about are either published or very close to getting published in peer-reviewed journals. So from time to time, I will indicate the journals, articles there from which I'm talking about. So you're more than welcome to refer to these papers for further understanding of the topic. All right. So, like I always start most of my talks, I begin with a very generic statement that humans are binocular creatures. We have two eyes, and eyes that are frontally placed in our heads, and these two eyes are working together for a reason, and the reason is for achieving binocular vision. And the importance of having that kind of a binocular vision is for improved performance in these four activities. Our ability to resolve objects in space as defined by the contrast sensitivity function is better under binocular conditions than monocular conditions. Technically, this is called binocular summation of spatial inputs. There is also summation of temporal inputs, time varying inputs that one of my students is currently pursuing. We are able to engage in very complicated tasks like gameplay, like cricket here, and navigating the streets in India. For both these activities, if the cricketer has to stop the ball from going to the boundary, he has to very precisely calculate the direction in which the ball is going, the distance the ball is going away from him, and also the speed of the ball. So it's a very, very complex task, but we seem to be doing it fairly seamlessly in our activities. And this, of course, is an even more daunting task. If you have to cross the roads, pretty much traffic would come to you in any possible direction. If you are in Hyderabad, people could land from vertically down on you as well. So you do have to be very, very careful in figuring out where is the car coming from, which direction is that guy coming from, is he going to hit you, not hit you, and all of that. The last one, of course, is something that we are all most familiar with, which is stereo depth perception. This is if you have red and green goggles, if you can wear those, what you will see is a very vivid sense of three-dimensionality of the statue from the background of that. And this is what typically gets spoken of over and over again as an important achievement of having binocular vision. We will also touch upon this as we move along in our talk. Now, in order for us to achieve that binocular vision, there are some very fundamental constraints that are required. One is the eye has to be frontally placed in the head. Unlike that of rabbits or other animals that have laterally placed eyes, we have frontally placed eyes, and the optic fibers, the fibers that come out of the optic nerve, they do intersect each other at the optic chiasm, and there's about 50% of fibers that ends up crossing over to the other side of the eye. So anything post the optic chiasm, the eye of origin information is practically lost, and information reaching the visual cortex in the occipital lobe of the brain is a combination of inputs that is coming from both eyes. Apart from these anatomical constraints, there are also some constraints in terms of the stimulus that the eyes are receiving. These are essentially the information that is out there in the world that goes through the optics of the eye and reaches the retina must be similar in all aspects, shape, color, contrast, focus, orientation, you name it, it has to be similar. It also has to be falling on what we call corresponding points in the two eyes, so that the brain can easily match the two together and get a single unified perceptor. If that doesn't happen, which it doesn't in obvious cases of strabismus and stuff, people go into a state of confusion or binocular rivalry. And if that is long-standing, then that results in suppression of sorts. So here is a demonstration of that, of what rivalry will look like. Once again, if you have access to a red and green filter readily, then you will be able to appreciate this. What we have done is taken a picture of two of my students, Reena and Vinay, and merged them together such that the left eye will receive Reena's input, right eye will receive Vinay's input. Clearly, they have very different features and they are non-fusible in terms of getting in terms of the brain. So the brain will go into a state of a rivalry. Now, this is, of course, a very, very extreme scenario, something that we have done purposefully for demonstration purposes, but something less intense but similar in concept ends up happening in the visual system, both under physiological conditions and also under pathological or iatrogenic conditions. So this will sort of become the primary focus of whatever we are going to discuss in the next half hour or something like that. So physiologically, for instance, if a person is looking at an object that's closer to one eye than to the other, like this man looking at the grizzly bear, he of course has bigger things to worry about than binocularity at this point of time. But conceptually, what happens is the picture of this, the retinal image of this bear is closer to the left eye and therefore is larger in size than the image that is over his right eye. Now, there is anisoconia that ends up happening for this individual. There is a difference in retinal image size and the brain has a hard time sort of fusing it. Ignore that for a minute. We get on to our pathological conditions. There are iatrogenic conditions. Many, many different disease conditions that have different disease severities or different presentations in the two eyes, or treatments done to only one eye, whereas the other eye is absolutely fine, all result in very different qualities of inputs that are reaching the retina. Unilateral or bilateral keratoconus is what we will spend a lot of time talking about today. But unilateral corneal transplants, where one eye is the native eye, a biological eye of the cornea of that individual, and the fellow cornea is now a transplanted cornea. Optically is much more distorted compared to the fellow eye. So the brain is having to deal with two different qualities of retinal images. Monovision for presbyopia, something that we may all be more familiar with, where one eye is purposefully made myopic relative to the other eye in order to increase the range of viewing, clear vision for a presbyope. Now, what that results in is at any given point of time, be it distance viewing or near viewing, there is always differential blur that's there on the retina. At distance, the dominant eye is clear and the fellow eye is blurred. The situation reverses when you are looking up close. So, like that, you could actually talk about a whole range of different conditions that all results in the single brain receiving two different qualities of inputs from the two eyes. So, the one that we will focus on specifically is that of keratoconus, where especially if it is a case of a unilateral keratoconus, one eye is quote unquote normal or a very, very early form of frustrated keratoconus, whereas the other eye is having a clinically diagnosed keratoconus of different intensity. What the brain is likely to receive is if a keratoconic individual goes to the Taj Mahal, they would see a clear version of the Taj Mahal in one eye and a distorted or a blurred version of the Taj Mahal in the other eye. Now, the brain now has a daunting task of putting these two images together and getting a single unified person. How does the brain do it? What challenges does the brain face in doing this? When does it decide to combine the inputs from the two eyes? When does it decide to say, I'm done with it, I will go with only one eye? So input are all the questions that we sort of ask in the lab, and we have made a reasonable amount of progress in our understanding of these topics. So keratoconus, as we all know, is the distortions of the cornea. What is usually a fairly uniformly curved corneal structure is no longer uniform. There is a change in the curvature of the cornea. It gets steeper in one region compared to the other. That's the cone in the keratoconus. You can categorize keratoconus into many different types based on the location of the cone, the shape of the cone. Is the disease progressing or not progressing? When did it start happening? A whole range of parameters on which you can categorize keratoconus. We will not worry about many of them today. Instead, we will lump all of them as one entity where there is distortion in the retinal image. And what is the consequence of that distortion to two conditions is what we will talk about. The first consequence will be for the optical structure and the image quality of the eye. And the second consequence is for visual functions. Now, I will first cover the optical structure bit here and learn what happens in the case of the retinal image. Based on this understanding, we will get to the visual functions, and the thought process will become a little bit easier to handle. What I'll also do is, time permitting, I will take a pause after we complete the optical structure and image quality and discussion. Take some time for questions and stuff, and then move on to the visual functions world of things. So optics of keratoconus is fairly well known, condition which is known to have high amounts of irregular astigmatism, increased amounts of higher order aberrations of the eye. So when you do retinoscopy, you end up getting a scissoring reflex. The astigmatism, two axes of astigmatism are not necessarily always 90 degrees apart, which is why we end up calling it as an irregular astigmatism. And you can see some data here that we published some couple of years ago, where we showed the magnitude of higher order aberrations measured over a 4 millimeter pupil diameter to actually be almost 4 to 5 times the size of a normal eye. So this is a control population with about 0.35 microns of aberrations in the eye. This is the total higher order aberrations of the eye. There are many individual components to it. We can get into that details later. But overall, every eye does have higher order aberrations, and there is a reasonably small amount of higher order aberrations of about one-third of a micron. Whereas look at keratoconus under unaided conditions, significantly higher than that of a controlled eye. Notice the case of a unilateral keratoconus. The ectatic eye now has an aberration that is about as much as the bilateral, but the fellow eye does not have a lot of different, lot of increase in the aberration. So the net result is there is also not only a distortion of image in the two eyes, but differential amounts of distortions in the two eyes. If you think about this from a point spread function point of view, this is how does an image, a point object forms an image on the retina, how much is that distorted? You see the point spread function of a control eye is fairly small. This is extremely small region of the retina that is being demonstrated here, only 10 arc minutes. And you see a very small point spread function in normals, whereas in the keratoconic eye, it is much more exaggerated, indicating the amount of distortions that's there. So this is what happens in the keratoconic eye. A normal individual has parallel light rays entering into the eye, does not have too much aberrations. All the light rays entering into the eye pretty much focus at one point on the eye, inside the eye. In this case, a myopic eye is described where the light is focused in front of the retina. Whereas an aberrated eye, light rays entering into the eye has different amounts of refraction going through, especially in the case of keratoconus, when light goes through the cone of the keratoconus, that has a lot more refraction compared to the eyes that do not have, that pass through the regular parts of the cornea. End result is the wavefront that is formed of the incident eye is very distorted. Light rays gets focused all over the place inside the eye, resulting in a much more complicated looking point spread function. So in case you are wondering what happens to the eye, what's the consequence of this to the retinal image, an eye chart that is supposed to look as clear as this ends up becoming very, very blurred. What you notice here is not only is it blurred, but there's also a lot of doubling that ends up happening. This is what your patients will either call as monocular diplopia or ghosting. And this tends to happen because of a specific kind of an optical distortion that happens in the eye. We will not talk about it in great detail, but this is to drive home the point that the blur on the retina is also quite complicated. More obviously, of a natural scene is seen here. This is the reference image, and that of a keratoconic eye, you can actually see the ghosting that happens if you are able to follow my cursor. This is the ghosting that's happening. There's doubling of this light. There's also doubling of the tail lamps here. So these are all pretty significant distortions that a keratoconic eye ends up facing. So how does one really compute all this image quality? So far, I have qualitatively described it to you, saying, hey, there is doubling, there's ghosting and whatnot. Turns out there are very good quantitative measures to compute these distortions. And you can do these just from the wavefront aberrations of the eye. There are 10 different metrics that can do it. You can do a mathematical operation called the Fourier transform and go into the point spread function. And there again, you have another 10 metrics. You do another Fourier transform. You can go into a third optical metric called the optical transfer function. And there again, you have another 10 odd metrics. So in total, there is about 30, 35 ways of quantifying what is the level of distortions on the retina. Of these, the metrics that are related to the optical transfer function turns out to be more closely correlated with visual acuity sorts of measures, with functional measures. And we end up using one or two of these metrics to describe the quality of the retinal image that is formed. You will see in the next couple of slides terminologies that are used of VSX or VSOTF or NS. These are all abbreviations at this point of time. That doesn't mean anything at all. It need not mean anything at all at this point of time. All that you need to know is this is a surrogate measure of how bad the retinal image quality is on the eye. So this is some work that Vinay had done. We had published this earlier this year in Scientific Reports. What he mapped was what we call as the through focus curves or a defocus curve for a optical system. Now, what we do with these curves is, by the way, this kind of curves is very regularly used by the by the contact lens and the intraocular lens industry, where they want to see what is the range of focus over which an individual can maintain a given retinal image quality. We sort of apply that to the condition of keratoconus. And if you compute this curve for a normal eye, control eye, what you see is very good quality retinal image right around emetropia. So this is an emetropic eye, the highest retinal image quality. And then as you induce different amounts of myopic or hyperopic defocus, the retinal image quality drops. And it drops more or less symmetrically on either sides. And you get this inverted V or U-shaped function. From this, we can compute what is the best image quality that an eye can achieve. Where does that image quality appear in the dioptric space? And what is the range over which the image quality remains above a certain threshold? We call that as the depth of focus. Now, when you look at this curve and compare that to a keratoconic eye, you see a very dramatic difference. This curve lacks any of the properties that I showed you for the control. So what you see is a very flat function that lacks a very distinct peak, and the overall image quality is very poor, and the range over which a given image quality is now huge. The depth of focus is much larger in keratoconus compared to that of a control population. This is an eye with only the lower order aberrations of the eye corrected. What I mean by that is only the sphere and cylinder components are corrected. All the higher order aberrations have been left uncorrected. Now, when the same eye is fit with an RGP contact lens, there is a certain recovery of the image quality. Some semblance of an inverted V shape is now achieved. There is some point where there is a distinct peak, but there is still a larger range of depth of focus compared to that of a control eye. So there's only a partial recovery of image quality that happens compared to that of a control population. These are examples from a bilateral keratoconic eye. Now, when you go to a unilateral keratoconic eye, the eye, which is the non-ectatic eye or the seemingly normal eye, resembles that of a control eye, whereas the ectatic eye now resembles that of the keratoconic eye. And the same properties, once you put on a contact lens, you see a little bit of an improvement in that. The point of emphasis here is the brain now has to deal with an image that is fairly clean and clear, compare that to an image that is extremely blurred out. Again, the same questions that we asked earlier in terms of what the brain going to do in terms of combining the input and stuff sort of becomes relevant in this context. This is more data analysis. What we see is as the image quality degrades, as you go from the right to the left of the x-axis, the image quality degrades, and you see a lot more variability where the best focus can happen. Practically, there is no single point where the best focus happens. It sort of happens all over the place. And the depth of focus of the eye is commensurately also very, very large. Now, what does all of this mean from a clinician's point of view? What it means is there is huge variability in terms of your subjective and your objective refraction. You really can't get a single point on the objective on the subjective refraction scale where you would say this is the best spherocylindrical combination that's achieved for a keratoconic eye. Pretty much any of the lens that you put in front of the eye, the image is going to look more or less similar. And the experienced clinicians in this group will sort of relate to this, that it's really hard to actually do refraction in a keratoconic eye because the patient's responses are extremely variable. They can't help it. Their optics is what's degrading the image so much, and the variability is much larger. In this particular data, you can see this is data from Tom Rasch in 2001. There is a large variability of almost 10 diopters over which the refraction in a keratoconic eye can vary, and close to about 5 diopters over which the cylinder can vary. The similar responses for a control population is no more than a half a diopter. And from a patient's point of view, no matter how much the image is degraded, the image is all going to look more or less similar to this individual. For all those optics enthusiasts in this audience, this is a picture of its Zernike. If you know aberrations, then you will understand what are Zernike polynomials. This is the man who defined the Zernike polynomials, and the paper, Lucy Savidis' paper, they have actually simulated a picture of how Zernike will look when blurred out with different amounts of astigmatism in this case. So what happens to optical structure? Very degraded and results in very, very poor image quality. And if you have an asymmetric disease condition in the two eyes, then you pretty much have to deal with two different qualities of images in the two eyes. Now, the consequence we briefly touched upon in terms of the eye not being sensitive to things, but in the next part of the talk, we will go through what is the consequence for all the visual functions and stuff. So like I said earlier, I can take a very quick pause and see if there are any quick questions that I can answer, and then sort of move forward with the second half. So Fakhruddin, over to you. I can take a quick pause for a few minutes.
So it's quite interesting, sir. I mean, we as clinicians or we as clinically oriented optometrists, we always look out for getting the best refraction. And as you said, it's 10 diopters and 5 diopters of fluctuation is always there. I mean, we never land up to a point where we say we hit a bullseye. Correct. So it's very difficult to get a bullseye refraction in keratoconus. That's right. Yeah.
Absolutely. So one of my students in the lab, Preeti, she is currently trying to handle this very complicated problem. She is trying to derive some computer algorithms that can help us sort of arrive at this best possible image quality over in these keratoconic eyes. And to some extent, she's been successful at doing this. We need to dig deeper into the data. What she has also been able to show is of the different kinds of aberrations that are there. Some of them are more detrimental to vision than the others. So there is some progress that's being made, but we will take some more time for us to handle this situation. Okay, that's...
Yeah. So there's one question in terms of what you mentioned. The results only include of RGP lenses, or it includes of Steris and other specialty lenses as well?
We will talk about that in the second half of the talk, where we did a study where we compared the different kinds of contact lenses and the impact on visual functions. A brief answer to that is the sclerals do a little bit better than the RGPs, but not a whole lot. They don't necessarily improve the optical quality or the visual functions a whole lot. We certainly expected them to do that, but that's not what we found.
Okay, okay. And anything about to manage the monocular pseudophakic patients? Any quick thoughts about, you said motor function will be disturbed. So it's kind of related to the pseudophakic aspect.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned that we are only going to focus about keratoconus in terms
That's
of...
okay.
Yeah.
So how do we manage monocular pseudophakic patient? Now, in terms of what would be that management that this Himanshu is asking, I'm not entirely clear. This could be management of the loss of contrast. It could be the management of not having very clear vision at whatever distance. So it's a fairly broad ended question. If Himanshu could clarify that, then I can maybe deal with it a little deeper.
Sure. We'll just request Mr. Himanshu to put up probably some more details, and then we can take up at the end. Yeah. Okay. And there's one question about chromatic aberration in the eye with degraded optic eye. Do patients with keratoconus degrade colored fringes around the...
We don't know the answer to this issue. We did think about this a little bit some months ago. There are two kinds of chromatic aberrations, as you know. There is transverse chromatic aberrations and the longitudinal chromatic aberrations. The longitudinal is more dependent on the how the light is getting refracted depending on the wavelength of that light. So unless there is some change in the wavelength dependency in keratoconus, one would not expect the longitudinal chromatic aberrations to change. The transverse chromatic aberrations, which are sort of dependent on the orientation of the lens, the location of all the optical points inside the eye, that may end up changing because of the distortions in the cornea. But I don't think anyone has really studied that, and it's not a trivial problem to also study. So bottom line, Ishwar, I don't know that we have a very clear answer for your question at this point of time.
Okay. And one last question. I think probably this relates to more of a combination type of question, which says that once the brain ignores keratoconus image over the keratoconic eye, will it be better to give RGP lenses because it improves vision by improving the...
I'll probably ask Shabnam to sort of hold off on this thought until we get to the second part. We do have some data in terms of suppression patterns in keratoconus. So I will talk at length about that. And if that answers your question, that's great. If not, then please ask this question again and we can talk about it at that point of time.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. So maybe I will carry forward. Yeah?
Yes, please. Yes, Dr. Srikanth. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. So moving on to the second part of the visual functions, which is what we are going to focus on now. So before we get into this, we need to know from the literature point of view, what do we really know about the visual functions in keratoconus? Now, this is the most recent systematic review and meta-analysis, and notice that it's done on a huge number of patients, 11,500 odd eyes. And what did they find? In their entire paper, there is only one paragraph that is dedicated to visual functions, and that one paragraph only talks about visual acuity. Now, as you all know, visual acuity is only one small speck in that entire visual function space. That tends to be the most commonly used metric for evaluating success of treatments and stuff. But the way we interact with this world involves using of functions that are much beyond just visual acuity, in terms of the contrast of objects that we end up seeing, in terms of the depth that we end up perceiving, in terms of the chromaticity of the targets that we see. There's a whole range of different things that we end up perceiving, and turns out that there is not much known about visual functions at all in keratoconus. So what we have done in the past maybe 3-4 years is to try and systematically understand what these visual functions are and what do they mean in terms of the distortions of the eye that we spoke of so far. So how do we measure these visual functions? We use a 300-year-old paradigm called psychophysics to measure it. So what this paradigm essentially involves is a systematic study of the relation between stimuli and the sensations that they evoke. What I mean by stimuli is I show a pattern of a particular form on a computer monitor, and the person looks at it. They use their brain to make a judgment of what that pattern is really looking like. Say, for instance, this is an example of one of my students doing a stereo acuity task. So the disparity of the stimulus in this case is varied, and the response that we are eliciting from that subject is, did they see depth in the target or did they not see? Your visual acuity measurements that you do day in and day out in the clinic, or the visual fields measurement that you do on patients with glaucoma or neuroophthalmic disorders, they are all psychophysical measurements. So there is nothing majorly new that we are doing there. There are a lot of limitations in the way we measure them in the clinic. So those limitations is what we overcome by adopting very strict paradigms of psychophysical paradigms in the lab. So this is what we do to estimate visual functions. And when we do study these visual functions, there are 5 aspects in which we have addressed this question. We have obviously looked at what happens to visual acuity, contrast sensitivity, and binocularity in these keratoconics, and what happens to all of these functions depending upon the type of contact lens correction. We looked at regular spectacles, conventional RGPs, rose case, mini sclerals, and a whole range of different lenses to see what happens to the how do these visual functions change as a function of contact lens correction, and can we computationally model it? Can we try and understand in terms of computer modeling to see how these visual functions are changing and how does the brain handle them? So the acuity data, monocular and binocular acuity, is data is from 2 papers that we published from 2018 and very recently in 2020. Vinay and Preetham were the lead authors in these papers, and what they found was the x-axis of this graph here is the severity of keratoconus. 40 diopters and stuff is for more or less a normal eye or a formiferous eye, and 80 diopters is a fairly severe keratoconic eye. These eyes were all classified in terms of the Amsler-Krumich classification, and we measured the visual acuity of these eyes. The band that you see here is the data from normals that we had obtained in that study. And what you see here is a progressive loss of best corrected, spectacle corrected visual acuity with an increase in the severity of keratoconus. Now, nothing majorly new that I'm telling you. As clinicians, you guys see this on a day-to-day basis, and that's the very reason why these patients have even come to your clinic, right? Now, what we find is in bilateral keratoconus, the binocular visual acuity is as affected as the 2 individual monocular acuities are. There is wide inter-subject variability that reflects the difference or heterogeneity of disease presentation in these clinics. But interestingly, when you look at monocular visual acuity, when you look at unilateral keratoconics, what you see is only the affected eye's acuity is worsened. The fellow eye, of course, is normal, and the binocular acuity is once again normal. Binocular acuity more or less matches the fellow eye's acuity. Now, why is this important is if you have a patient with bilateral keratoconus, they are likely to come to your clinic earlier, because under normal binocular viewing, there would be a compromise to the visual acuity. Whereas if you're dealing with a unilateral keratoconus, they are likely to reach you much later, because their binocular acuity will always be clear as it's defined by the fellow eye. Only serendipitously, when they end up closing the good eye for some reason or the other, dust fell in the eye or soap went into the eye, they had to clean the eye and close their eye. That's when they realize that through the other eye, they are not seeing very clearly, and then they come to you. Now, what this also indicates from a physiology point of view is when the visual system encounters two very different acuities in the two eyes, it ends up going with the binocular acuity invariably is defined by the better eyes acuity. This is what we call in the lab as a winner-take-all strategy. So between the two eyes, if the fellow eye is the winner, then the binocular system essentially goes with what the winner is telling it to do. Nothing unique to keratoconus. We have seen a similar strategy in patients who undergo corneal transplants. Other people have seen this in patients fitted with multifocal contact lenses, monovision, a whole range of things. The visual system adopts a fairly uniform strategy in this case. So contrast sensitivity, which sort of defines the entire area, the visible area of an individual, is severely compromised in keratoconus. The more keratoconus, so what you plotted here is the area under the contrast sensitivity curve, essentially the pink area that is shown here in this graph. As the severity of the keratoconus increases, the area under the curve practically drops and drops and drops, meaning it gets really shrunk what the keratoconic eye is actually able to see. And compare that to a normal eye, you have much better contrast sensitivity function. For those of you who are quite familiar with this curve, a normal contrast sensitivity curve would have a cutoff close to over 30 cycles per degree, corresponding to over 20/20 acuity. Whereas a keratoconic eye has now a much lower cutoff point, indicating a severe compromise to the visual, severe compromise to the spatial vision that they are seeing. Stereo acuity is pretty much standard. Practically, your keratoconic eyes do not have any stereo acuity. If normal stereo acuity, clinically accepted stereo acuity is about 40 arc seconds, these individuals are in the range of about 300 to about 1500 arc seconds. This is box plots that are showing in data from bilateral keratoconics, unilaterals, and controls. You can see the controls here, very, very small and small stereo acuity values. Whereas these keratoconics with the spectacle corrected and the median stereo acuity is about 600 arc seconds, and unilateral keratoconics about that much, about 500 odd arc seconds. When you correct them with RGP contact lenses, there is certainly an improvement in the stereo acuity, but it never really reaches that of the control population. So pretty much the story as far as visual functions is concerned is every aspect of visual function that we have studied, acuity, contrast sensitivity, stereo, they are all quite poor. The worse the keratoconus gets, the more severe is the degradation of the visual acuity. Now, once again, this is nothing very, very new. Experienced clinicians know this already. Now, when it comes to correction of the keratoconus, you do therefore have a lot of different options that is there for you to correct it, all the way from spectacles to your most advanced scleral contact lenses. There's a whole range of them that are there that are meant for the correction of these lenses and correction of this condition. And these lenses all have a whole range of different fitting philosophies, comfort levels in the eye. The cost to the patient are all significantly different. So considering the whole range that is available when you have to fit, what is the evidence of the visual functions improvement? Is one lens doing any better compared to the other lenses? So this is what Preetham asked in his study. And what we found is data that is similar to what I showed you earlier here. This is the old data that I showed you in terms of spectacle correction. And when you fit the eye with Kerosoft contact lenses or rose case RGPs and sclerals, you certainly see an improvement that has happened compared to a spectacle corrected conditions. Any of these contact lenses are doing much better. And the improvement is more so for the severe guys than for the early eyes. But what was a little bit lukewarm in terms of a response was there was no significant difference between the performance of these four lenses. The difference was not very, very strong Sclerals may have done a tad bit better than your RGPs and your Roskis, but not a whole lot. Keresoft, at least in our cohort, did not do very good. So in the order of improvement in visual acuity, Spectacles was, of course, resulted in the worst performance, followed by Keresoft, then Roske, then are these two guys, your RGP contact lenses and your scleral contact lenses. Contrast sensitivity function was very, very similar, where Keresoft didn't do great and RGPs and mini sclerals did an equally good job. Stereo acuity, a very, very similar story. So bottom line, even though you have a whole range of different correction options in keratoconus, from the visual functions point of view and also from the aberrations point of view, these lenses do not do terribly different from each other. Now, what will end up defining whether one lens has to be fit on the patient or the other probably is got to do more with the fitting comfort and the long-term wearability of these lenses and stuff, more than the visual functions itself. Cost is also likely to play a very predominant role because the scleral lenses are at least 10 times more expensive than your RGP lenses. So depending upon affordability also, the choice of the lenses may actually define. But at least from the visual functions point of view, they all do more or less similar kinds of behavior. So a question of paramount importance, at least for my lab, is why is the visual function so poor in keratoconus? What is the reason for this loss? The obvious reason for loss of spatial vision is the amount of aberrations in the eye that I spoke to you earlier. The aberrations are, like I said, is at least 5 times to 6 times more in a keratoconic eye compared to the normal eye. And even with an RGP contact lens, you can only reduce the aberrations to about half. It is still about 2-fold larger than that of a control eye. So sure enough, the improvement in visual functions that happens with RGP lenses is also partial. We are currently sort of building an adaptive optics setup that will enable us to completely correct the optical aberrations of the eye. Then we can start looking at whether the improvement in visual functions matches that of a controlled population. So increased optical distortions is the reason for loss of spatial vision, we think. The other reason, which is where a computational modeling sort of helped us, was where we looked at the reason why binocularity is compromised in keratoconus. Now, what we did, I won't get into the details of the we did was an analysis where we fundamentally try to understand how does binocularity work. So if you are able to follow my video, essentially what binocularity is a matching of inputs from the two eyes. So it is mathematically what we call as a cross correlation that ends up happening. And the best possible overlap matching between the two eyes is what will result in the best quality of binocular vision. That best possible match you can actually achieve in a control eye. And you can see from this red function that at the point where there is best possible match, you get a fantastic improvement in stereo acuity. And the stereo acuity pretty much drops drastically as it becomes more and more mismatched. Compared to that of a keratoconic eye, where there is nowhere that you are able to get a best possible match. The match is only approximate in the keratoconic eye. So as a result of which, there is problems with correspondence in keratoconus, and disparity calculations are heavily impaired in keratoconus, resulting in the stereo acuity to be quite poor. What we are also currently pursuing is to now say, when the two eyes have dissimilar image quality, does that eye, both of them, do they even function equally well in keratoconus, or is one eye more suppressed than the other? So towards this end, Bhagya in my lab, she is currently looking at a paradigm where she is using binocular rivalry as a means of measuring the amount of suppression that's there in the eye. So one point for all the students in the group is very classically, we think of suppression in the clinic as a binary phenomenon. Suppression is present or suppression is absent. Turns out that's not the case at all. Suppression is a graded phenomenon. You can actually quantify the amount of suppression on a percentage scale, with 0% being no suppression at all and 100% being an absolute suppression. Anywhere between 0 and 100, you could have a patient one eye being suppressed relative to the other. Be it amblyopes, be it keratoconics, be it any other condition, the suppression can now be graded in the scale. And there are many, many psychophysical paradigms that you can actually use to grade this suppression. And Bhagya is using a rivalry paradigm. So what she does is shows people these kinds of gratings, black and white gratings of opposite orientations. When you fuse these gratings into a single percept, the eye will go into a state of suppression, will go into a state of rivalry. Now, rivalry, as it turns out, is a very interesting phenomena where the two inputs to the left eye and the right eye is actually constantly switching over from the, so the right eye's input is there for a few seconds and then switches over to the left eye's input, comes back to the right eye, so on and so forth. So it keeps on switching. And the switching is very symmetric, turns out. And this is a control population data, control subjects data. And you can see the switch that is happening between the right eye and the left eye, very more or less uniform switches that's going on in the two eyes. So now when you do the same paradigm in a keratoconic eye, you can see that the stronger eye is dominating the perception. The weaker eye does see it, but now for very short periods of time. So what was a very symmetrical switch in normals has become a very asymmetrical switch in keratoconus. So from this, what we can do is quantify the amount of time that the visual system spends in the stronger eye and in the weaker eye, and say this is the level of suppression that the eye is now experiencing, the weaker eye is now experiencing. What Bhagya then also does is, if I go back to this picture, she ends up reducing the contrast of the good eye. Assume that here the left eye is a good eye. She reduces the contrast of the good eye and gets to a point where the inputs between the two eyes are actually now more or less matched. This is what we call as the balance point. This is a balance between the inputs in the two eyes. The logic being that in a keratoconic eye at baseline measurements, when there is 100% contrast targets that are presented to the two eyes, one eye is getting more degraded compared to the other because of the disease itself. Can we get to that degradation by changing the contrast of the good eye? And how much reduction do we require in order for us to reach that point? So what Bhagya then found is the degradation. This is a very complicated graph, so I won't get too much into the details of it. What we did find is, for a control population, you did not need to degrade it very much at all. Very close to 100% is where the balance point is. But as the disease is progressing, the balance point progressively shifts to lower and lower contrast. In other words, the eye is mildly suppressed here, little bit more suppressed there, and even more suppressed in the severe case of keratoconus. So the suppression pattern turns out to be very much related to the underlying disease severity. Less intense, less difference in the two eyes has very little suppression. Very large differences between the two eyes tends to have a much more deeper suppression. However, you quantify the disease severity either in terms of the acuity or in terms of the keratoconic topography, you get very, very similar results. The suppression does reduce. The suppression does reduce when you are wearing a contact lens compared to a spectacle. Suppression is also reduced when you are looking at a low frequency target, a coarser target compared to a very fine target. So the suppression that we end up seeing in keratoconus is there for sure. The weaker eye does get suppressed, but then the properties of that suppression is not a constant one. It tends to depend upon what type of target that you are viewing, what type of correction that you are wearing, and how long you have experienced the keratoconus and stuff. Another very tantalizing thought process that is also there in the literature is, because of the long-standing blur that the keratoconic eye might experience, there may be some level of neural insensitivity as well. And the way these two guys, Sabeshan and Yoon, they studied this about 10 years ago, was they fully corrected the optics of the eye using their adaptive optics setup, and then they measured the acuity. Now, turns out that the acuity, notice here that the acuity is all lesser than 0, so better than 20/20. A normal eye could achieve as much as minus 0.25 logMAR, whereas a keratoconic eye could achieve only about minus 0.1. So lesser than 20/16 acuity, here almost up to 20/10 acuity. Based on this, they have proposed that there is neural insensitivity that is there, because of the long-standing blur. Now, again, these are the only two papers that I've looked at it. They haven't been more research on this, so certainly an area that needs to be explored. So the possibility of a keratoconic amblyopia, not only an anisometropic or strabismic amblyopia, could there also be a keratoconic amblyopia? So just sort of coming back and summarizing the whole thing, the second part of the talk, we did a lot about visual functions, and then we looked at a whole range of different ways to understand visual functions and what we have achieved so far. So in summary, we know that the optics of the keratoconic eye is very, very bad because of the increased higher order aberrations. Primarily spherical aberrations, coma and trefoil are exaggerated in these eyes, because of which there is a severe deterioration of retinal image quality. The consequence of this from a clinical point of view is a very elusive endpoint of objective and subjective refraction. The visual functions consequences is very grossly suboptimal when you correct a keratoconic eye with spectacles. There is partial recovery with RGP contact lenses or any of the other cousins of the RGP lens. Partial recovery is probably because of either the residual wavefront aberrations that is there, or could be because of this neural insensitivity business. And finally, the eye does seem to be suppressed. One of the weaker eye does seem to be suppressed in keratoconus. The depth of that suppression seems to depend upon the intensity of the disease and what kind of optical corrections for the target that you are bearing. So with that, I will end my talk, and I want to thank you for all your patient listening. And I'll take some questions if there is any. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Srikanth. Thank you so much. I think you did answer that question which we were supposed to take. I think that was well covered. But so in the meantime, there is only one thought or one take-home message what I think I can get out from, you know, the extensive research work what you have done and made our life much more easier. So we don't have to go and look about it. As clinicians, I think when we were understanding keratoconus, or when we were learning about keratoconus in terms of lectures and all that, we always thought that, you know, the visual outcome is the one which we need to think about always. But I think now that's not the only case. We also need to look about other factors as well, right?
Correct.
Because as per your research analysis, almost all type of lenses give similar kind of visual function, which get better compared to spectacles, but then there's not much of significant differences, right?
Correct. So the unfortunate thing, or the fortunate one, however you want to think about it, is the visual functions that tends to usually get evaluated in any kind of medical, in any kind of ophthalmic practice, is only visual acuity. And that turns out visual acuity is only a reasonable measure of visual functions. It's a quite blunt measure in that it doesn't really pick up too much of the nuances in the optical quality laws and stuff. So one of the implicit messages that I want to give is to expand your measures to other functions as well, depending upon what the subject is, so what your patient is looking at, and the complaints are, please to evaluate those functions as well. They may show a much different picture compared to visual acuity.
That's right. And I think contrast sensitivity function could be one of the easiest thing available for.
Correct.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Nowadays, we have this LCD screen projector, you know, visual acuity charts, which do have low contrast VA measurements.
Correct.
So do you think that would be a good measure in terms of people who have access? Because we may not have contrast sensitivity like FACT or Pelliropson in an optical setup, but definitely we'll have these LCD fancy visual acuity charts which has these low contrast VA measurements.
Yes.
If that could be one step ahead to measure.
You are right. You are right about it, Fakhruddin. See, what it turns out that high contrast visual acuity does not degrade very much with blur, and low contrast visual acuity, on the other hand, shows a much more dramatic change. And you think about it, most of the times in this world, we really don't see that high contrast of a target. Our day-to-day living, does comprise of targets that are much lower in contrast and stuff. So it makes sense to actually evaluate it also using the low contrast acuity target. I would also measure high contrast acuity because that still continues to be the gold standard measurement, but not restrict only to that.
That's right. Yeah. So probably adding just a simple quick test on doing low contrast VA, and that could probably give you one of the criteria on whether I should be prescribing this or not.
Correct. Correct.
Right? All right. So let's see some questions here, sir. I'm just putting up on the slides as well. Yeah. So this question is suppression in keratoconic eye always same, or it does changes with the progression of keratoconus?
Ibrahim, you will have to give us 6 more months to answer this question, because I don't think anyone really knows the answer to this. Suppression is something that we are demonstrating it only now. Now, how does it change with the disease progression or with the type of the disease and stuff completely remains unanswered. What I would imagine is that the suppression would become deeper as the disease progresses, but that's only a conjecture at this point of time. I do not have any evidence for it one way or the other.
Okay, right. And the next question, let's look at that. The severity of suppression is only measured by spatial frequency, or would you recommend any other tests?
Yeah. No, we looked at the, so you can actually have like 5 or 6 different ways in which you could measure the severity of suppression. Like I said earlier, we happen to choose rivalry and spatial frequency based measurements. There are others that ends up involving moving dots, or they involving showing patterns where you have to match the alignment between the targets. So there's quite a few of them that are out there to measure the severity of suppression, but all of them are what we currently are laboratory-based techniques at this point of time. I don't think anything has really become translated into the clinic. One of the downsides that I did not focus on is, in order for us to get the severity of suppression in keratoconus, it took us about 45 minutes or so, at least 45 minutes. Now, that kind of time you do not have in the clinic. You actually need to have much more faster, optimized algorithms and solutions for that. There are many groups that are working towards that, including us, but I don't think we are there yet to actually have a clinical test where you can quickly measure the severity of suppression. We still are sort of using the Würzburg dot test as a measure of the suppression.
Yeah. And this is just a question which we wanted some more clarification about pseudophakia. So in terms of binocularity, like patient always says, when it comes to operating the patient, when we leave one patient pseudophakic and the other eye, the patient does not want to probably get operated, what do you think, or how could we manage this kind of patients?
So this opens up a whole another can of worms other than keratoconus. But it's an important one to think about, because what does a unilateral pseudophakia really mean? In terms of the quality of the image, one eye tends to be much better compared to the other eye. So a unilateral pseudophakic, while acuity of that unilateral pseudophakic might be defined by the better eye's acuity, say the operated eye's acuity, other functions like stereo acuity and things like that are likely to be affected in this individual. So from that perspective, it makes sense to sort of try and make the optical quality similar in the two eyes. One of the other things, a bit of an esoteric thing, but something that one of my students has been working in the lab, is to look at the Pulfric phenomena. So the Pulfric phenomena is something where if you have reduced luminance to one eye compared to the other, you start seeing abnormal depth perception. Now think about a unilateral pseudophakic. So one eye is clean optics, all the light is going into the eye. The other eye now has some amount of cataract that is basically reflecting a lot of light out. So through the eye with the cataract, there is lesser light reaching the retina. compared to the fellow eye. So these patients do tend to experience full effect, and they see abnormal depth. So we don't necessarily want that from our elderly patients. So another case for why you want to try and get both the eyes operated as quickly as possible. But having said that, you do not want to also tend too much in the other direction of pushing the patients to get the surgery done just because you want to avoid all of these kinds of issues. There is also a business angle to the whole thing that I will not get into at this point.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And a couple of more questions here. So, what do you think could be a standard assessment in terms of distorted optics, probably as a clinical perspective, if you would want to highlight?
Two things, Shabnam. One is the corneal topography, and the other is wavefront aberrations. These two are fairly good measures of how distorted the optics is. Many of the topographers and the wavefront aberrometers also give you a simulation of a letter chart. So a letter E or an eye chart and things like that. That will give you a fairly good estimate of how bad the eye chart is actually appearing to the patient, and if some of their symptoms can be explained by those simulations. So topography and wavefront aberrometry are two things.
Okay. And so I think that's all the questions what we have. Thank you, Dr. Srikanth, once again for enlightening us with something unique, and definitely the more important aspect is you try to relate it more clinically. So we understand as most of us would be clinicians, and we'll relate this knowledge to our clinical practice.
Yeah. Thank you very much. No, it's a wonderful opportunity that you have given me, Fakhruddin, and I truly enjoyed the session and the questions, and I wish you all the very best for many more sessions of Wools. So I look forward to more such talks.
Yes, we will look forward to get you back in some other way so that we can have some more interesting sessions with you, sir.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. And to the attendees, just a couple of informations to share. So we do have a case presentation series, as well as you can also present any of your research work onto our platform. You can submit your abstracts and we'll get the scientific committee look into it, and you can present it onto our platform, and we'll schedule your presentations once the approval of the abstracts has been done. Before I end, let me take the privilege to, in kind of wish everyone, because this would be the last session of the year 2020 for OOLS. And I would like to take this time and opportunity to wish everyone a fruitful, happy new year. And I wish 2021 would be better or more efficient in terms of practices compared to 2020. That's how I would put it. And let's be positive. I think things are getting in a good direction, and let's keep our fingers crossed to make sure that we give our best in terms of our clinical practice. So thank you everyone for attending today's session. We do have session planned next weekend. Stay tuned. Until then, take care, stay safe, and I will see you all again next week in a new year. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Thank you.